recording, and I'll enable chat transcripts. All right, welcome everyone to today's last and final webinar of the year, but it's a good one, I promise. It's entitled Service Integration and Management, Service Management for a Complex World. I'm pleased to introduce Claire Agutter. Hopefully I did that right. She's a leading expert in SIAM and founder of SCOPISM, which focuses on publication, events, and all things service integration and management. I invited her to speak with us today because, like you, I work in a highly federated environment. Actually, maybe some of you have been able to centralize, but I think most of us work in a highly federated environment where many of our business units and academic departments rely on central IT services to support department level service offerings. So as a supplier, if you work for a central IT organization, how can we better partner with our service consumers? Fun fact, Claire was nominated by Computer Weekly as one of the most influential women in UK tech. Congratulations. Also joining us and helping me is my colleague and friend, Chris Whitehead, who before coming to USC worked in the private sector, such roles as service level manager and supplier management. The event will follow this format. Presentation will last about 40-45 minutes with time left over at Q&A. We will be holding all questions until the end, but feel free to put your questions in the Q&A window and we'll get to them at the end. Everyone will be on mute. And if you want to ask a question live during the Q&A, feel free to use the raise hand feature. I'll take you off mute, but please put yourself back on mute when you're done asking your question. We encourage you to use the chat feature to talk with each other. I'll send out a recording, the chat transcripts, and any ancillary materials within 5 business days. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Claire.
Thank you very much, Mitch, for that introduction. I will just share my screen. So hopefully you can see that now.
Looks good.
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today, whatever time it is for you. Absolutely fantastic to be here with you, and thank you to Mitch for the invitation. As Mitch said, I'm going to be talking about SIAM, Service Integration and Management, which is really an approach for service management in this complex world that we all live in now. So many of us now having to deal with multiple suppliers, complex services, and kind of complex customer environments as well. So Mitch touched on that there too. We don't all work in very simple systems where it's just centralized IT and the customer. We have internal customers that we're dealing with as well. So SIAM is an approach that's developed to help us manage some of this complexity, and hopefully what I'm going to do today is give you a good introduction to that. So here are the topics that we're going to be discussing and a little bit of context as well. So most organizations use multiple suppliers as part of IT development, delivery, and there's a lot of benefits to doing that. We can gain access to skills that we perhaps don't have ourselves as an organization. We can right-size services, we can create more scalable services, and there are financial advantages to doing that as well, because most of us have squeezed budgets now, and certainly my experience in working with universities in the UK is that cost can be quite a driver. But as our supply environment becomes more complex, that creates challenges. It creates management overhead. It creates a need for new approaches, really, that we have to try and manage. So what I'm going to do in this session is introduce service integration and management. So where did it come from? Look at how SIAM relates to other practices. Talk a little bit about how SIAM might be applied in a university. So this is John from my experience working with the University of Edinburgh. It's not a case study because we're still in very early stage discussions with the university, but I thought it might be helpful to speak a little bit about, how SIAM came up in that conversation, why they're looking at evolving their service management approach, and a little bit about the challenges that they have and the kind of the setup that they've got at the moment and where SIAM might fit into that. And then I'm going to pull in some insights from our Global SIAM survey, because we do, for the last 6 years, we have surveyed practitioners around the world. So just some kind of insights there to give you a bit of a feel for who's doing SIAM and kind of what benefits they hope to achieve. And then we'll close with some additional resources as well. So I think rather than sending Mitch lots and lots of PDFs to share with everybody, I'll tell you a little bit about our online community, which is a place where you can access a lot of SIAM information. So if you, after this this session, if you're inspired, you want to read more, then the community is the place to do it. So I'll share that, and I'll share my contact information as well. Like Mitch said, questions mainly at the end, but if there is anything sort of urgent that I spot in the question box, which I think I've got open correctly, then I'll kind of pick that up. I'll keep half an eye on that as well. So if we start with a little scenario, you're working from home. Many of us do these days. We work from home sometimes, most of the time, depending on the role that we have. And let's say you find you can't access the internet anymore. What are you going to do? And it may be that the first thing you do is check any hardware that you have in your home, check the router that you've got. Does it have the lights on that you expect to see? You might try and connect to the internet using a mobile device. You might try a hotspot and see if that works. You might think, well, do I have any power to my house? You might think, has there been some kind of outage with my provider? You might look out the window and think, is there anybody digging up the street at the moment who might have gone through some cables? Because that is something that seems to happen fairly regularly. The city where I live recently had a major outage where somebody was digging up the road and took some of the fibre with it. And the reason that I say this is just to introduce the idea now that the services that we work with are complex, and there tend to be multiple providers involved in the provisioning of those services. If it's work internet, you might have a work help desk to call. If it's a personal one, you might have a personal supplier that you use. But we're very heavily digitalized in most of what we do. The services that we use, we rely on, they are complex, and we don't always have a full understanding of everybody who's involved, and the impact of that can be fairly significant. So this is, in a very small way, the origins of SIAM. And if we take this to the university level and think about online learning environments, if we think about the AV that we use, if we think about the registration systems, if we think about things like internet access in student halls of residence, the services that we're providing now are both complex and critical. One of the universities that I worked with had an outage which affected the system that they used to allow students to submit work. So people were missing deadlines, and that was causing huge amounts of stress. So there's a lot of thinking that we need to do as we design, as we develop, and as we roll out these services. And this is really the roots of SIAM, service integration and management. There's a little image on this screen, which it may resonate with some of you who work in operational roles, about what happens when something goes wrong. So let's say, the library systems are experiencing an outage, and you might ring the software provider that you have a contract with and you've got a help desk number for, and the software provider says, no, everything looks fine from here. Can you maybe check with your network team? So you have a chat with the network team, and the network team say, no, everything looks good to us. Maybe there was some security patching last night. Maybe try having a chat with the security team. And quite often what happens is we end up in this finger pointing scenario where the service is down, people are affected, people are getting a bit ticked off and annoyed about it, But we're struggling to manage this as service providers because we don't have people who are working together. We have people who are working in silos, looking at their own little section, you know, their own set of targets, their own contracts, sometimes even deliberately kicking the can across to somebody else. And it's scenarios like this that led to SIAM, and a bigger picture as well. You know, the real origins of SIAM come from UK public sector, and this realization that we were spending a lot of money on IT projects and we weren't getting the value that we needed. So how do we create a service management approach that delivers value from IT investment and allows us to leverage these best of breed providers? So you can see a definition of SIAM there, in that it's a management methodology that can be applied in an environment that includes services sourced from a number of service providers. So it is a type of service management. And for those of you that are familiar with things like ITIL, you'll find a lot of commonalities between them. But this is specifically looking at how do we now apply these concepts in these multi-sourced ecosystems, which, you know, more and more of us find ourselves existing within. So, for example, ITIL has guidance on incident management and how we make sure that things are resolved in a timely way, you know, they're prioritized. But like the example I've just given, sometimes that falls apart a little bit when you've got this more complex environment. So SIAM adds guidance to that to help us make sure that we manage these things appropriately. So what SIAM does is it provides this end-to-end governance and management, this integration of all the little pieces of our services to ultimately make sure that the customer organization gets what it wants. You know, it gets the outcomes that it wants, it gets value for money, it gets a return on the IT investment, which is so crucial now for any organization, whether it's public or private sector. And SIAM has a roadmap, which is essentially about understanding where we are and then developing an operating model which allows us to take advantage of these SIAM principles. And it's something that I guess probably won't be a surprise to most of you who are, you know, working in the IT industry. But it's worth emphasizing because SIAM is a means to an end. It's a way of delivering value. It's not something that perhaps, you know, replaces service management or the processes that you already have. It's something that builds on that. And what it is, it's an element that needs to be integrated into an operating model to allow you to manage particular types of services. So I think it's kind of always worth mentioning that this isn't just like you're not an ITIL organization or a PMP organization. It's not a case of, well, we're going to be a SIAM organization now. It's looking at, can we integrate SIAM into our operating model? Are there some elements that we can bring in that are going to allow us to manage our services more effectively? Because the critical thing that SIAM does is it introduces a role of service integrator. And depending on the size of organization that you are, that service integrator could be one person. It could be an internal team. It can be something that you outsource to another organization, but it introduces this role which is responsible for this end-to-end governance and management of services and really focuses on building a culture of collaboration. So rather than when something goes wrong, everybody pointing fingers, SIAM is very much about how do we bring people together? How do we switch that mindset away from these are my targets, this is what I need to meet, and then I've done my job? How do we switch that mindset so everybody wants to come together, everybody wants to work together, and everybody wants to focus on delivering value, which can be a significant change. And it's something I would be very interested in hearing from the people on this session, because when we do our research, what we tend to find is that SIAM is reasonably mature in the UK, Europe, Australia, Asia, But at the moment, SIAM isn't seen as being particularly mature in the USA. And one of the things that people have suggested to me is that there is a more contract focused culture within the USA. So you contract a supplier to do something, you expect them to do it. There isn't this then interest in kind of having a more collaborative relationship with the different suppliers. So I would be interested to hear people's thoughts on whether that is correct, what kind of relationship you have with your suppliers. It would be very interesting for me, because that is one of the things that we do get told, is that there is this cultural difference between perhaps how we treat suppliers in Europe and perhaps how they're seen in the USA. So that would be good for me. It's not just about me doing research, but it would be helpful to find out. So digging into the origins of SIAM a little bit more, it's worth thinking about the maturity of the outsourcing industry and how that maps with the development of SIAM. Because if you think about the kind of the origins of outsourcing back in the 80s, a lot of the big outsourcing contracts were happening, 10-year contracts, really broad scope. But over time, a lot of organizations started to think, I'm not sure this is quite working for us, this big monolithic contract. So, rather than an organization outsourcing its entire IT to another organization, we start to think, well, maybe we want to work with these people for software development, and maybe we want to work with these people for end user compute, and these people for support. And how do we knit all of these contracts together to have the same, in effect, single view from a customer perspective, but we're able to have best of breed, and we're able to have something more scalable. So as outsourcing's evolved, as customers have moved towards shorter contracts, more suppliers, that's where SIAM's evolved as well. And ultimately, service providers play a crucial role in supporting business outcomes. So, we're talking about IT. We have an IT audience for a lot of the SIAM discussions that we have, but ultimately, poorly delivered services directly affect organizational outcomes. And I think that most organizations have come to understand that, particularly in recent years during the pandemic, because suddenly we really appreciate what IT and digital services allow us to do. At the time, I was teaching a service management module for a university in Estonia. So pre-pandemic, I would go out to Estonia for a week and teach a module as part of an MBA looking at service management and service design. I was scheduled to go out just before the pandemic started, and then got quite a panicked phone call to say, actually, you're not going to be able to come. We need to do this online. And that first time we ran the module online was challenging, because the students weren't ready and the students were very stressed, and I wasn't particularly ready either. I was trying to work out how to deliver the content in the best way possible. So that first time was a bit of a challenge, but then the next time we were much more ready, the students were much more used to it, and the technology had come on as well. Simple things like breakout rooms in the collaboration tools that we were using really helped deliver a much better experience. But you can imagine what it would have been like trying to deliver education during the pandemic without the digital skills that we have. So it's been a real kind of acceleration of digital transformation for a lot of organizations, and it's really emphasized how crucial these services are. And just a couple of examples here that we use in the SIAM space, but the bottom one's probably more relevant to this audience. Maybe a lecturer arrives to deliver a tutorial. In the lecture hall, there's a laptop, they don't know how to log into it, the AV isn't working, you've got students turning up, the lecturer doesn't know who to contact. And again, it's an operational example, but this is the end result of the services that we commission and deliver to our end users, to our audiences. So we really do have to think, as we design services, as we go for procurement exercises, as we create contracts with different organizations, what are we building here? What's the end user experience going to be? How is all of this going to work together? And what SIAM gives us is the tools and techniques that are going to really help us to make a success of that. And I'll come on to this a little bit later in the section about the university, but certainly the universities that I've worked with, there is that additional layer of complexity that Mitch mentioned in the introduction, where you might have some central IT services, you might have IT services that are commissioned at a departmental or a school level, but even then some of these have got to knit together, and we have to understand the big picture. If there is a major incident, or even when we come to a contract renewal or a contract refresh, we have to understand how all of this fits together. So having this service integration mindset can really make the difference between success and failure, and it can actually help us to optimize our costs as well as we start to understand our environment. So this is a kind of a brief history of SIAM and Scopism, which is the organization that I founded. SIAM as a term was first used in around about 2005 in the UK public sector. It was in our National Health Service where a lot of the kind of the SIAM concepts originated, and there was a big IT transformation happening in the health service at that time. You can imagine the size, the scope, the number of different providers that were involved, and this is where the thought process began that we need a way to manage this. And then fast forward 10 plus years, I've been in service management my entire career, and at the time I was running a training business, doing some consultancy, and I founded Scopism with the idea that service management's evolving at pace. We're seeing DevOps, Agile, Lean IT, Green IT. It's getting quite challenging to work in service management and keep up with all of this. So I founded Scopism to start to look at how service management is evolving. And SIAM was one of the areas that I picked up on, because what had happened was UK government had developed SIAM. The private sector had looked at it and said, oh, this looks interesting and potentially a commercial product. We can sell service integration to organizations. So the big consultancy organizations, Tata, Wipro, HCL, Infosys, Atos, had started to sell SIAM services, but it did mean that if you were curious about SIAM as a practitioner, if you looked for information, you Googled it, all you would find really was adverts and maybe a little bit of a blog from one of the organizations. There wasn't a book for SIAM. There wasn't a body of knowledge like there is for things like ITIL and Prince2 and PMP. So what I did through Scopism was pull together a big group of cross-industry experts from all sides of things, the service providers, the service integrators, the customer organizations. And we wrote the SIAM Foundation body of knowledge. So we wrote it over a 9-month period. And really the goal was to create something that would tell people the key concepts of SIAM. Let's agree a definition. Let's agree some terms. Let's look at roles, challenges, benefits, skills. And that was where the SIAM project and the SIAM and Scopism relationship really started. So then in 2017, we partnered with Exin, who are an examination body, and they deliver SIAM Foundation certification. We then got some feedback that, the initial body of knowledge is great, but can you give us more? So we published the professional body of knowledge, and then from there we moved into things like SIAM conferences, the Global SIAM Survey, we've refreshed the body of knowledge, we have a maturity assessment, and we now have a SIAM community. And you may be looking at this and thinking, yeah, that's great, why do I care? One of the things that is really important to me about the SIAM bodies of knowledge, the SIAM research that we do, it's all freely available. So you can go download the foundation body of knowledge, the professional body of knowledge, you can access all of our research, and it's all completely free. So I will share that with you at the end of this session. But it's just an illustration really of how SIAM has progressed, and it's kind of it's come from the service management community. We've then codified that knowledge and shared that knowledge, but this is something that has very much developed from service management practitioners. It's a need that's been identified, and SIAM fills a gap, solves a problem that people are finding when they're working in these complex environments. So SIAM is a response to this complex world that we live in. It's pretty much essential for digital, for cloud services, and really it should be part of the skill set of any IT service management professional. So for all of us now, we need to be refreshing our skills, refreshing our knowledge, but having an awareness of SIAM, having an awareness of these concepts, starting to think about this as we go through sourcing exercises, starting to think about how we build these collaborative environments is really, really important. And as we digitally transform as organizations as well, it is very much now about this affects our business processes too. So it's not just about IT services, because now our IT services are business services as well. So SIAM is gradually extending across the enterprise, as a lot of our service management processes are. So one of the things that is helpful to think about is how SIAM fits into perhaps what we already do, so the other practices that we have, and also to kind of emerging trends as well. So, many of you will be using ITIL processes, you'll be familiar with things like supplier management, so it's useful to look at how SIAM links into those. And the first question that a lot of people ask is, isn't this just supplier management? We already do supplier management. We understand supplier management. And what this image here shows you is just the two side by side, and it's just a comparison of quite often a typical organization at the moment, and then an organization that's adopted SIAM principles. So without SIAM, most organizations do supplier management. They do supplier management quite effectively. And what that means is they have, contracts with each service provider. They'll do contract reviews. They'll have reports and service level agreements. But it's all managed in silos. So we're having one conversation with one service provider, one conversation with another service provider. We're not necessarily seeing that big picture. And that can lead to overhead, to waste in effect, because we are duplicating some of these activities, and the customer organization actually ends up spending a lot of time doing that. And the other thing that's worth looking at in that particular diagram there is the fact that we're looking there at internal and external service providers, because quite often there are internal teams that are very involved in service provision, but not all organizations manage them as effectively. They don't manage them with the same rigor that they apply to an external service provider. So looking at the image on the right, once we adopt SIAM, we bring in this role of a service integrator. And like I said, this can be one person, a team, you can outsource it. But the service integrator starts to have these conversations and have them in a much more joined up way. So you see a lot more supplier roundtables in a SIAM environment. You see a lot more incentive for these people to work together, and internal service providers and external service providers are treated absolutely the same. It's very much about we all provide a piece of the jigsaw. And if we're not all contributing, that picture that we're trying to make won't be successful. So service integration is about building this collaborative environment, moving away from a fixation on penalties and targets, and actually looking at the bigger picture. You know, and a very quick example of that in a lot of SIAM environments, what you'll find is contracts that instead of penalties when service targets are missed, that money will be dedicated to improvement activities, or two service providers might work together on an improvement initiative, and ultimately that can unlock, you know, innovation, new services that would never have been possible. So yes, there's elements of supplier management, vendor management within SIAM, but this is a much more long-term approach. It's a mindset shift as part of our operating model. It begins when we are looking for our service providers, and it's all the way through to operating and running those services as well. And then another question is about that relationship with SIAM and IT service management, or ITIL, which again, most service management practitioners are familiar with. You will find, as I've said, most of the same processes, but what SIAM is doing is extending that guidance for this multi-supplier environment. So an example there is, you know, with your end users, you might have a contract that has a 4-hour fixed time or a 3-hour response time. But then what happens if that incident is sent to the wrong service provider, first of all? You know, how long do they sit on it before they have to triage it and pass it on to somebody else? And then what happens with that next service provider? What does it say in their contract? And a lot of organizations find they've got really misaligned metrics and reporting structures. So there's elements of that within traditional service management, but what SIAM is doing is giving you the playbook for how you make this work in these more complex environments. What we've seen in the most recent version of ITIL, ITIL 4, is the first mention of SIAM from an ITIL perspective. So the owners of ITIL have kind of recognised the importance of SIAM and included, I think, a chapter or two on it, because they're seeing the same things, and their thinking is very much towards value streams and service management systems. But they've recognised that SIAM needs to be part of this operating model, which is good to see. It's good to see these things becoming more aligned. And then looking at SIAM and DevOps kind of agile thinking as well, because a lot of organizations will say, oh yeah, but we've gone to agile now, so how does that work in a SIAM environment? But really the principles don't change. So a lot of traditional SIAM models are very much about, you know, here's our supplier who does application development, and here's our supplier who does support, and here's our supplier who looks after operations. In a DevOps environment, you might have full stack suppliers, service providers who do everything from development through to operation and improvement. We still need to be able to pull them all together. We still need to understand from the management level who does what, how does it all link together. So while there might initially appear to be a little bit of conflict between the two approaches, they can and absolutely do work well together. And then I also wanted to kind of touch on experience management as well, because this is more of an emerging trend, but it's something that a lot of organizations are talking about. I think probably if you came to Alan Nance's session, he would definitely have been talking about experience. But again, experience management and SIAM can and should be integrated in our operating model. And what the service integrator can do is feed into that experience measure by looking at not just how is supplier A performing, how is supplier B performing, but what's the kind of the lived experience from the end-to-end perspective, and perhaps where we've got one supplier who's not enabling the experience that we want to see, then the service integrator can take action to address that. So that's definitely something that we're seeing, again, more alignment coming through. So that's the origins of SIAM. That's a little bit about how SIAM fits into the broader service management landscape. The next area that I wanted to touch on is a little bit of thought about applying SIAM in a university. So I have a relationship with the University of Edinburgh, which goes back almost 20 years, which is really frightening when I think about it. I started delivering their ITIL V2 training. I've done some ITIL V3 training for them, and I've done some consultancy and maturity assessments for their service management. So not engaged continually with them, but this ongoing relationship. And my counterpart at Edinburgh was hoping to be here. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here. So she's reviewed these slides and kind of okayed for me to share them. But the last piece of work that I did with the university, we discussed how SIAM could potentially be an approach that resolves some of the challenges that they're having. So I thought it'd be interesting, particularly for this audience, to share that thinking. But I think, again, as with most higher ed organisations, IT services form a key part of the university strategy. They are what helps to attract students and staff. It's part of the experience, and it's also part of delivering services in a cost-efficient way. So not necessarily a low-cost way, but making sure costs are managed, and things like automation, knowledge sharing can really help that. And what we have at the University of Edinburgh is a team called the ITIL team. They sit within the centralised IT provision. So they kind of provide service management for the centralised IT services, but they also provide support to the other departments. So the other departments are commissioning and running their own IT services, but the ITIL team do provide some support and guidance to them. So everything from kind of a little bit of insight when the commissioning services, how that might fit into the broader landscape, through to things like major incident management and problem management when it's needed as well. Some of the challenges that the University of Edinburgh is facing, and again, these may resonate with some of the people who are watching this. Loss of some of the current staff, so some staff turnover and the knowledge that goes with that. And then struggling to recruit into those roles as well. So some gaps, which might mean that that there's a decrease in the quality of some of the areas of service management while there is that recruitment gap. Investment issues, questions, so additional service management isn't always prioritised. So there are some of the processes that are very weak or don't exist at the moment. The relationships between central IT and the services that are provided within the schools and the departments. So making sure there is that good relationship, there is that visibility, there is that two-way conversation, and different levels of maturity as well. So some of the different departments and directorates are much more mature in terms of how they manage their own IT than other areas. And this is perhaps reflected in the different levels of reporting and management information as well. So some of that isn't particularly good quality, and some of the senior managers that I was speaking to were a little bit frustrated about their ability to access information. And duplication of services as well. So laptop loan was one of the examples, which is something that could perhaps have been more efficiently done centrally, but there were different schemes in different parts of the university. And again, that's quite a challenge to manage. So the last time I was working with the university, these were some of the challenges that we highlighted. And then it was looking at, from a service management perspective, what could we potentially do to help address these? Specific supplier management challenges that the university was facing were general supplier management challenges. So different directorates, different schools were moving to cloud-based services, but the contracts weren't necessarily as good as they could be. There was a little bit of confusion about what had been agreed where. Different suppliers having different targets and different service level agreements, but somehow all of that has to knit together. A lack of clarity about, what contracts we have, what suppliers contribute to value streams, who owns and manages those relationships, the dependencies. So just generally not being able to see that big picture. Some areas of good practice and very specifically managing particular contracts, but not necessarily being able to give that big picture. And that makes it much harder to plan strategically. It becomes immediately obvious in things like incident management, but ultimately it makes it very difficult to plan strategically because we don't understand where we're starting from. So one of the suggestions that I made in my most recent report to the university was to think about how perhaps SIAM principles could help to address some of these challenges, and having the ITIL team as a centre of good practice seemed like an ideal opportunity to have some experts who can provide support from procurement all the way through to existing services, to share templates, to share kind of things that could be included within contracts, and then things like during major incidents, support there because they understand who's involved and they can build on this culture of collaboration that can encourage those suppliers to work together. Some of the benefits there that we discussed were things like, visibility, removing redundancy, consolidation and associated cost savings, being able to innovate and actually to flex as well. So one of the things that a SIAM model does is allow you to add and remove service providers much more easily. You have less lock-in. So through the academic year, as needs maybe grow or shrink, there is that possibility to scale the services. So chatted those through with the university, and that there was, the feedback is that there is very much a recognition that whilst ITIL is doing a great job for them, there are other elements of service management like SIAM that should be added into the operating model and will deliver benefits. And at this point, I'm just going to hand over very quickly to Chris, who's just going to share a couple of learnings from his experience with SIAM, because Chris does have SIAM experience and wanted just to share a couple of key thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Hey, everybody. If people don't know me, I'm Chris Whitehead. I work at USC with Mitch on the IT service management team here. But in a past life, I used to work in a SIAM group in the United Kingdom. In fact, part of the UK public sector that Claire mentioned earlier, that kind of were some of the first folks using SIAM. So whilst that was almost a decade ago now, since I finished up there, there's some things of relevance, I think. So at that time, we were doing outsourced SIAM. It's since now been insourced because there are some inherent issues with outsourced SIAM. Because if you are the integrator sort of in the middle there between the customer and its vendors or its suppliers, there's some inherent distrust from some of the vendors to you as a different vendor who is not the actual customer. It was really more of a theoretical issue because everything was totally solid, but it didn't always sit well with some of the other vendors. So it's always better to do it in-house where you can. I did see there was a note in the chat about from Dana about where that might fit in a university. I think that's a really interesting question. I think the answer would wildly vary depending on the institution and how it's set up. If you were looking to do a SIAM role where you would integrate your local IT groups that are federated perhaps with your central group, that might be, you might want to set it up in one way. If you already have fully centralized or mostly centralized IT, you're really looking to integrate your vendors, your suppliers more, you might want to set it up in a more traditional way there. I'll speak to that a little bit because that was really more our experience. We were doing multi-vendor management, where this part of the UK government had number of contracts for its IT services with a large variety of different companies. So, they had infrastructure, data center piece with one, they had desktop with another, they had their application development, software management split up around 3 or 4 vendors. The network, of course, was with somebody else. The issue there is, if this is something you're considering, I would say that, and Claire hinted at this, they went from having lots of long-term contracts to with a smaller number of vendors to having more and more contracts with more and more vendors for shorter amount of time. Short amount of time contracts were actually make the SIAM integrator piece very complicated, because you spend at least half of your time onboarding and offboarding people into your system. So if you think that it's like a 3-year contract, we found most of the time it took at least 6 to 12 months to get people fully up to speed. And then you have to start offboarding them 6 months before they're out. That's half the contract length at that point. So that I would encourage people to consider the value exchange if you're having short contracts like that. Of course, sometimes there are inherent advantages to having short contracts in a different way. The other thing is that if you're going to do that with multiple vendors, you really want to have the contract language be absolutely as consistent as possible across all of them. Because if you have people working on the same things and they have wildly different contracts, it makes the management of that so much more complicated, because you want to have consistent service levels across the piece as much as possible, so that everybody is working to the same service levels, so that the measurement, the reporting of that is much easier, and so that they can't all turn around and point the fingers at each other for why it's somebody else's fault. We found that everybody always wanted to blame the network group, which I think is true in most of IT, but in this situation, everything always went to the network group. The network group was able to show it wasn't them, and there was just a lot of time wasted on doing that kind of infighting there. And then the final thing I was going to mention, and I think Claire touched on this earlier, is that I think we see less maturity in the SAM space in the United States. My suspicion in some cases is that is comes down to who has leverage, who has power. So in the case of the UK government, giant organization, huge amount of power, huge amount of investment capital, really able to tell the vendors most of the time, this is how it is. Universities much less frequently able to do that. Very often, it goes the other way. You're going to be told how it is a little bit more often by the vendors, because they're bigger than you, and in that kind of situation, who has the power and the leverage often wins out. So I think that's something to think about. And I think very often we want to look more for partnerships than pure vendor transactional relationships. Certainly we have been trying to do that with some of the vendors we work with. Sometimes it works out well, sometimes it doesn't. But if you're able to foster a spirit of partnership as much as a transactional fiscal relationship, you'll be better able to leverage a SIAM model, because there's more of a shared sense of ownership. So those are my thoughts from a practical perspective. Thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate that. I took a moment there as well just to cut out some slides, because I'm conscious we're running out of time. So Mitch, I'm sure we'll share the full deck, but I've just I'll just run through these last few slides, and then hopefully we will have time for 1 or 2 questions. I mentioned that we're now in our 6th year of running the Global SIAM survey, and there's a ton of data online, so I'll leave you to dig around in that if you're interested. But one of the things that I did pull out as interesting is these are the people who come to the Scopism website to download SIAM resources, to interact with SIAM information, and you'll see there that the US is at number 3. So whilst we don't see a lot of take up in terms of SIAM certification, we don't see a huge amount of maturity in SIAM, there is clearly some interest, and we're seeing that traffic to the website. So I'm hoping that gradually this will be absolutely something that gradually develops in the US. And this is the SIAM benefits. So looking at the last couple of years, the benefits that our respondents report. So I'll leave you to read those. But management information, collaboration, performance. These are things that we all want from our IT services. So hopefully the benefits of adopting SIAM are clear and are measurable. And then I just wanted to finish up with a few resources which I've mentioned through today. We've launched an online community which is free to join, and everything that I've mentioned is in there. So the bodies of knowledge, the white papers, there's a ton of webinars, recordings, there's working groups you can get involved with. So the URL is there to join the online community, and it'd be great to have you in there. We've got some initiatives looking at North America launching next year, so it'd be great to have North America represented in there even more than it is already. And I touch on the fact that there is a certification program as well. So, you know, if you're interested to learn more, there is foundation training, which is at the same level really as kind of ITIL foundation concepts, benefits challenges, how to, that kind of thing. And then more advanced training that you can get from various different training providers as well. So I've sped up the last little bit. When Mitch shares the deck, there are a few more slides in there, but I wanted to leave a bit of space for questions. But I'll just end on this slide, which is my contact details, and Steph, who is our community manager, Steph's contact details as well. We're very much about community in the Scopism world and the SIAM world. So if you want to follow up with me afterwards, if you've got questions, comments, anything that you want to share, by all means, please do. And that's me. So thank you for listening. Mitch, apologies for taking a little bit longer than I said, but
oh no, this was a lot of good information. I think that this is new for a lot of people, so I think people are just kind of digesting it. So I encourage you, go through the slides when they're available after the recording, listen to the recording, join the communities, and get your vendor, your supplier managers engaged. So this was very helpful. Thank you, Claire. I appreciate your time, and Chris, your time as well. Thank you for your insight as well. Claire's contact information can be found in the deck. At the end of this recording, as soon as I kind of hang up, if you will, you'll receive a link to take an exit survey. Please fill that out. It helps us to deliver on content like this, if this is important to you, or other content that you may be interested in. A reminder that the transcripts, the chat transcripts, and the recording and presentation will be available. All the links that Claire talked about are in the deck. It'll be available within 5 business days. And also just a reminder to check out our past recordings, which I provided a link in chat. You also get a link in the email that I send out. There are literally hundreds of past recordings, something you'll find interesting. And it's a good place to view upcoming events and look at all of our past recordings. So just a reminder, we're reaching the end of the year. You've probably, if you're part of the EDUCAUSE community group, you'll have seen some emails from me. Do take a minute to participate in that. We're looking to develop our programming for next year. We have a number of hot topics from the EDUCAUSE conference that we're looking to explore, a couple working groups we want to spin up and continue, ITAM being one of them, experience management being another, more work on the popular service catalog paper, so lots of exciting things happening. And you know, I'm always looking for guest speakers. If you are in your organization doing something that you think is awesome, or at least worth sharing, let me know, reach out to me, and we can schedule time and I can walk you through the whole webinar planning process. So keep an eye out for any opportunities that come your way. And again, thank you, Claire and Chris, for your time today and your insights. And thank you, everyone, for attending. So appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye.